What's the case for free trade? What's the history of free trade in the United States? And is undoing free trade a good grand strategy for the United States? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow at the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from inside of Peter Navarro's head, so if you hear any crickets, that's why. I decided I needed to devote the whole episode today to trade because, unfortunately, that is the center of our economic conversation right now. The good news is there's a lot of good stuff that's been written about this, and I just had a cover piece for National Review magazine about free trade, and so I wanted to go through some of those ideas because I think they're really important to remind people of. Basically, nothing I'm going to say on this podcast is new. It's all stuff that we've known since at least 1776. Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations. Really, we knew it before that as well. And a lot of the arguments we're hearing from the other side are just as old. And so the idea that it's silly to repeat things that have already been said, I think it's not true because clearly they bear repeating. Because the same mercantilist arguments from the 1600s are still being used today. And so, one of the points that I make in my cover story for NR about free trade is that usually how the debate gets framed is that the free trader is this idealistic utopian person who thinks that free trade is this magical thing that makes everybody peaceful and happy, and that can only happen on paper. And in the real world, what we need is protectionism because, sure, we'd all love for there to be free trade. It sounds nice in theory, but it just can't happen. Supposedly free trade is a utopian position and protectionism is the pragmatic, realistic alternative. But I really just don't buy this. I say this common framing of the issue, it's exactly backwards. Protectionism is a utopian theory based on the assumptions that individuals and businesses will act contrary to their self-interest. Government will act in the national interest, and special interests will stay on the sidelines. Free trade, on the other hand, is how you live your everyday life. So I want to stress that point. Protectionism is a utopian theory based on the assumptions that individuals and businesses will act contrary to their self-interest, government will act in the national interest, and special interests will stay on the sidelines. So protectionism says that the natural human regard for self-interest that undergirds trade is actually a disease in need of treatment. Trade is an incredibly normal thing for human beings. It's one of the things that separates us from the animals. We trade with each other and we do so in a way that's mutually beneficial. We look for opportunities to trade. It's part of human nature. Protectionism says that impulse is a problem that needs to be cured. And so it's based fundamentally on the desire to change human nature, which is a form of utopianism. The idea that we need to reform people and make them new and change them into something that they're not. And so it's positing that people need to act contrary to human nature to really thrive. And somehow the agent of the reformation that needs to happen is the government. Protectionists must hold a very idealistic view of government, and they must place an extraordinary amount of trust in the government to execute their plans. If the government is not as competent or as beneficent as they believe, their plans won't work. The protectionist believes that government is the right agent to cure the supposed disease of self-interest because it can take the entire country's interests into view. In their view, government somehow transcends the concerns of individual people and businesses, and it looks out for the good of everyone. It lacks self-interest of its own, and it holds national security and prosperity as its aims. That is a theory of government. It's an extremely idealistic one. It's hard enough to get the government to focus on the national interest in military matters, which is the most fundamental purpose of government, and military members have sworn oaths to renounce their self-interest and serve the country. We're thankful that they do that. But citizens at large have not sworn any such oath, nor in a free country should they be expected to. And government is very unlikely to be able to redirect their economic activity for their benefit. Because we need to remember, it's not an unfortunate side effect of tariffs and other trade restrictions that they benefit some people and industries over others. That's the point. That's what they're for. Tariffs are by their nature redistributive. They redistribute between industries by reshaping patterns of trade and their associated flows of money. And because they're a tax, they also redistribute money from the private sector to the public sector. Trump is out talking about how that's a good thing. So the protectionists must have faith that government will pick the right industries to benefit for the good of everyone. What about the track record of the federal government makes you confident that they're going to be able to do that? Supposedly, this is all based on a careful analysis of national security needs, the benefits of job creation, the balance of trade, the trade practices of other countries, the government's revenue needs. But even if that analysis is done competently and fairly, which it won't be, it just won't be. It's not how government works. But even if they did it fairly, and even if they did it with all of the best, smartest people getting together, those goals conflict with each other, and the analysis will not recommend a clear course of action. For example, the only reason the U.S. has a trade deficit with Canada is the large amount of energy that we import from Canada. Excluding energy trade, the U.S. has a trade surplus with Canada. So by Donald Trump's own measurement of trade deficits, which is wrong, to be clear, but even by his own measurement, the U.S. has a trade surplus with Canada if you exclude energy. And crude oil from Western Canada trades at a steep discount on global markets, in part because it's relatively difficult to refine and transport. And several major U.S. refineries are specially built to process that oil. This is a great deal for the United States. But it's also the cause of our trade deficit with Canada. Though Canadian oil imports are largely responsible for the U.S. trade deficit with Canada, they probably reduce the U.S. trade deficit with the rest of the world because the refined products that we export are more valuable than crude oil. Canadian oil imports are widely viewed as good for national security, since they've largely supplanted imports from the Middle East. But they're still outside the U.S. jurisdiction, and they could be cut off in a war. So what's the national security answer? I don't know. Restricting Canadian oil imports would cost jobs at the U.S. refineries that are designed for them. But those businesses only exist because the Canadian oil is allowed to come into the U.S. at a discount and undercut American crude oil producers. So what's the job creation answer? I don't know. So it's hard to say what to do about the trade deficit with this. It's hard to say what to do about national security. It's hard to say what to do about jobs. So what's in the national interest with respect to Canadian oil imports? From protectionists' own point of view. They have this superficially sophisticated view of trade and the national interest, but really you can use it to talk people into just about anything. Because all those contrary arguments on Canadian oil imports are all made in good faith. None of them are obviously wrong. So if people can be talked into just about anything, then some people will be willing to spend lots of money to talk government officials into the thing that benefits them. There's a word for that. It's lobbying. Lobbying is an integral part of protectionism. It's not an unfortunate side effect. Trade restrictions by the U.S. government are usually legally required to take into account comments from the public, which includes businesses and trade associations. And even if they weren't, the First Amendment guarantees the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Another word for that is lobbying. Protectionism in a democracy will always involve special interests. You see that when the Trump administration talks about carving out certain industries, punishing some industries over others, punishing some countries over others. There's also the simple fact that trade associations often have the best information about the industries they represent. So when the government is doing that analysis that the protectionists want, it will be reliant on potential beneficiaries of the policies it's crafting. That obvious conflict of interest is ripe for exploitation. The protectionist case rests on a belief that people in government will ignore those special interest groups when they are arguing against the national interest. But of course, when those groups are making their case before the government, they will all argue that their interests are in the national interest. So politicians will have cover to decide however they want. Politicians also have a way of arguing that the national interest coincides with their own political considerations. And so it's probably not such a mystery why domestic steel firms are the top beneficiaries of protectionism in recent years. No, it's not because of national security. The Secretary of Defense said in 2018, during the Trump administration, that the military needs only 3% of domestic steel production in the United States. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Pentagon procured specialty steel from foreign producers to build vehicles to protect soldiers from roadside bombs. They did that after trying to get the steel domestically, and domestic producers just couldn't get it done. So they went to our allies. Both major party candidates in 2024 were basically running to be the president of Pennsylvania, which is known for its steel industry and its powerful steelworkers union. The candidates knew that whoever won that highly competitive state and its 19 electors would be very likely to win the Electoral College, and they acted accordingly. That's why on the issues of steel protectionism, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris basically sounded exactly the same. Both of them wanted to oppose Nippon Steel's acquisition of U.S. steel. Both of them were in favor of steel tariffs. Both of them were angling to get the endorsement of the United Steelworkers Union. I don't have to tell you, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are very different people that said lots of very different things on the campaign trail. But on this issue, they said the same thing. What does that tell you? It's political consideration. You think they both did a big old national security analysis and weighed the jobs that are created there against the jobs that are lost elsewhere, and they both happened to decide that it was worth it? No, they were both trying to win Pennsylvania. Political decision-making is the rule, not the exception for politicians. It's their job. It's in the name. It's naive to pretend otherwise. But protectionists have to pretend otherwise, or else their plans will have little chance of working. Now, it's possible to design an academic case for tariffs. Economics textbooks often mention an optimum tariff, with supply-demand graphs to illustrate it. It posits a scenario where a country has monopoly power over a particular good, so other countries will not retaliate with their own tariffs, and the tariff is set at a very low rate, which is calculated to improve the terms of trade with the rest of the world without raising prices too much domestically. That works on paper. It's important to note that as a theoretical exception in an economics textbook. But it hardly resembles any real-world tariff, and it certainly doesn't justify blanket tariffs on all goods from entire countries like we've seen from the Trump administration. The real test of this is economist Stephen Moran. He created an academic case for tariffs in a paper that was called A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. He argues that the US dollar is overvalued because of its status as the world's reserve currency, which makes US exports unduly expensive for others to buy. He devises a scheme of tariffs, deregulation, and currency actions to rectify this perceived wrong. It might work on paper. And Moran's advocacy for tariffs earned him a spot in the government as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Trump. But even putting him in the government has not led to his ideas being executed as he described. In his paper, Moran says that because Trump has a history of caring deeply about financial markets, that a second Trump administration will be likely to take steps to ensure that large structural changes to the international tax code occur in ways that are minimally disruptive to the markets and the economy. He wrote that to help minimize uncertainty and any adverse consequences of tariffs, the administration can use credible forward guidance similar to what's used by the Federal Reserve across a range of policies to guide expectations. They haven't done that at all. Moran also advocated phasing in tariffs gradually, subject to clear conditions. He suggests that, for example, you do a tariff on China by increasing the tariff rate by 2 percentage points every month until certain demands get met. That's not at all what the administration is doing either. Now, Moran makes clear in the paper that he's not doing policy advocacy, and he has made clear in recent days that the administration is not actually following the plan that he laid out. He's very modest in the paper about the chances of this succeeding. He says that the path is very, very narrow. And basically, it's an academic exercise. Again, it's perfectly fine as an academic exercise. But it's very silly to believe that government will act as an economic practitioner, fine-tuning the world economy for the good of the country. So again, protectionism is the utopian view. The individuals and businesses will act contrary to their self-interest. Government will act in the national interest. And special interests will stay on the sidelines. It doesn't happen in real life. Free trade, on the other hand, happens all the time. There's a sort of cynicism that says, oh, well, there's really no such thing as free trade anyway, because all these countries do all these barriers and blah, blah, blah. And countries do all sorts of barriers, and those are bad, and they should stop it. But we do have pretty close to free trade with lots of different countries and lots of different goods. And we absolutely have free trade inside the United States. Because the Constitution prohibits the states from levying tariffs on one another, which effectively created the world's largest free trade zone when it came into effect in 1789, and that zone grew as the country expanded westward. Internal trade barriers were common in other countries at the time of the founding, and they still exist in some countries today, including Canada. This is a radical idea from the founders. Now, if the protectionist argument is right, why is it right only for countries? Many U.S. states are larger than many countries, so it's not a geographic or population issue. It's not as though there isn't significant variation in wealth between states. Massachusetts has roughly double the GDP per capita of Mississippi, and its average hourly wage is over $14 higher. If anything, the case for protectionism between the states should be stronger than between countries, because it's much easier to move production to another place under the same laws where the people speak the same language and have access to many of the same public goods than it is to train new workers on a different continent. And of course, the manufacturing center of the U.S. has in fact moved. Historically, it was in the Northeast, and then it moved to the Midwest. Now, we're in the midst of it moving from the Midwest to the South. A lot of those jobs that were supposedly taken by foreigners in Ohio and Michigan actually were taken by other Americans in Texas and Alabama. If the Constitution didn't prohibit it, should Massachusetts have tariffs to protect its workers from Mississippians? Maybe some protectionists would be consistent, but it's doubtful. When the level of analysis is changed from international to interstate, or even more absurdly, intercity, it's clear that free trade is superior, even though it will also result in job losses for some people as production moves from place to place. That happens. It absolutely does. It's unfortunate for the people to whom it happens. But there's no such thing as a dynamic growing economy where everyone does the same job forever. And it's not any less bad if those jobs are taken by other people in the same country than if they're taken by people in other countries. Trump gives away the game on this when he talks about how tariffs would disappear if Canada became a state. He's right, they would. But that would mean that the same people would be buying and selling the same stuff. So the basic economic picture wouldn't change at all. The biggest difference would be that around 30 million Canadians would be voting in U.S. elections. Seems better to have the economic gains without the political consequences by having a free trade deal with Canada, which is exactly what the U.S. has done, first negotiated by Ronald Reagan in 1988. In your day-to-day life, you run up enormous trade deficits with the grocery store, the gas station, restaurants, and Amazon. They take your money and they give you stuff, and you never give them any stuff in return. This is a good deal for you because it means you don't have to can tomatoes, refine oil into gasoline, learn how to make Indian food, or build your own toasters, televisions, and tables. There are, of course, things that you think are important that you keep in-house, your familial national security exceptions, as it were. But there are plenty of very important things: food, water, children's education, religious services, home security, that the vast majority of families outsource to others. And it works fine, because that's a normal human thing to do. You probably outsource more in your day-to-day life than the U.S. does at a national level. For all the talk about how we don't make things here anymore, imports of goods and services equaled only 14% of U.S. GDP in 2024, which is one of the lowest rates of any developed country. And the reason for that is we have that enormous 50-state free trade zone that the Founding Fathers created. Rather than make more stuff on your own, you specialize in a job you want to do and you get money for it. When you take that money into a furniture store, it functions as a certificate that says, I did the work required to have this couch, but I did it doing something else I'm better at than making couches. And other people paid me for my work, so you should let me buy this couch in exchange. You exchange the money for the couch. Both you and the furniture store are better off, and your labor is magically transformed into something that you didn't make. That's free trade. You were free to go to that store or to a different one. If you weren't, that lack of competition would be considered a problem. Might even be against the law. The government doesn't tax you at a higher rate in one store than it does in another, regardless of whether anyone feels bad for the store's workers or because the store's owner donated to a certain politician's campaign. Nobody seriously believes that the government could restructure the furniture store system in such a way that everyone would be better off. So the argument for free trade doesn't require a suspension of disbelief, which protectionists need to make their arguments. You can accept human nature as it is, and you don't have to believe that the government is a benevolent planner that can make the country richer, safer, and fairer by taxing imports. In other words, sure, we'd all love for there to be protectionism. Sounds nice in theory, but in the real world, it can't happen. So I want to look at the history of free trade now, especially as it relates to the United States, because there's a lot of nonsense coming from the president about this. He's weirdly obsessed with William McKinley in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense. William McKinley is generally viewed as like a okay president. Not terrible, not great. The idea that you really want to like tie your presidential legacy to William McKinley is just really weird. And it's especially weird when the arguments that a lot of protectionists make are that free trade is this like tired old ideology and we need the fresh new ideas of William McKinley. So, he was president late 1800s into the early 1900s. He was assassinated and Teddy Roosevelt became president. He was his vice president. And that's how Teddy Roosevelt became president. And my colleague, Dan McLaughlin at National Review, wrote a really good piece called Beware Zombie McKinleyism, because there's just no reason that this guy or this period of American history should be what the United States should be emulating today. So the first thing to know that Dan points out is that McKinley's support for tariffs actually came more when he was in Congress than when he was president. When he was in Congress, he led what was called the McKinley Tariff. It was enacted in 1890, halfway through Benjamin Harrison's presidency. And it was done by Republicans. It was a little over a month before the midterm elections that it was put in place. And it raised tariffs on household goods. So this directly impacted people's everyday lives. In much the same way that Trump's tariffs, once they start to go into effect, will do. And this led to one of the great electoral wipeouts in American history. Obviously, it's never just one issue in an election that makes the difference, but the tariffs didn't help. And Republicans lost 93 out of 179 seats in the House at that time. More than half of Republicans in that election lost their seats. Dan says they went overnight from a 179 to 152 majority to being outnumbered 238 to 86 by Democrats. McKinley even lost his own seat in this election. Now, McKinley then went on to be governor of Ohio instead. But voters then threw Benjamin Harrison out of office, and they brought back Grover Cleveland in the 1892 presidential election, who was a supporter of free trade. So just the idea that this was like a great genius political strategy at the time. No, it wasn't. It didn't work at all. Now, Dan says the actual smart thing that McKinley did is he learned from this mistake. And in 1896, when he was running for president, they weren't talking about tariffs as much. Now, he still supported tariffs in principle. Tariffs were still high in the U.S. around this time compared to what they are today. But McKinley focused on sound money. Dan says that he rebranded himself as a champion of sound money and stable prices. Now, McKinley proved to be a pretty able politician once he got in office. But there's just not a lot of great economic evidence to suggest that tariffs were the reason for his presidency being somewhat successful or for the United States being very prosperous at this time. You can look at a paper that just came out last year from two economists looking at the evidence. Tariffs, that just says basically that tariffs didn't really do much of anything. And it makes sense, right? Because what tariffs do is they redistribute money from some people to other people. They don't make more money. They don't make people richer. They make some people richer at the expense of others. So when you look at that from a country level, you wouldn't expect there to be any big effects in the aggregate. But the real point that Dan makes that I think is really important to drive home is that 1897 was just a completely different world than 2025. The first thing is, that Dan points out, is that we have an income tax now. In the 1890s, they didn't have one. Most federal revenue at that time came from tariffs and other excise taxes. So a government that has no income tax, no payroll tax, is a very different thing than a government that does have those. And the income tax is a less distortive way to raise money than tariffs are. The second point Dan makes is that McKinley's presidency was a time of enormous population growth. We had high birth rates in the United States, and we had mass immigration at the same time. He says that the census showed that the U.S. population grew by 30.2% in the 1870s, by 25.5% in the 1880s, by 21% in the 1890s, and by 21% again in the 1900s. So in a country where the population is growing by that much, yeah, you're going to have a lot of economic growth just because you have so many more people coming in and making stuff. We do not live in a world where the population is growing by that much today, and Donald Trump says he wants the population to grow slower by reducing immigration. The third point Dan makes is that world trade at that time was very, very different. During the 19th century, Americans were playing catch-up to Britain. We're not playing catch-up to anyone now. We're the top dog. The argument that they made for tariffs in the late 1800s was that America was not the top dog. And we couldn't compete without having protection. That's just not true anymore. And so those basic ideas about why our economic picture is so different now than it was then just shows that the same policies probably aren't going to be a good idea today. But maybe there's some argument you could make that tariffs should be a good geopolitical strategy. We hear this about all the time, especially with respect to China. The tariffs are needed, even though they will have bad economic effects. We need to accept those because it's worth it for other grand strategy reasons. And well, my colleague Dan wrote another really good piece about why that doesn't make any sense either. International trade is like one of the founding ideas of the United States. The Boston Tea Party was a protest against tariffs. One of the things named in the Declaration of Independence was that George III was restricting the ability of the colonists to trade with other countries. This is at the core of our being. And as long as we've had a military, as long as we've had a navy, from the founding generation on, it has been used to preserve and defend international trade, even in other parts of the world that are far away from the United States. The Barbary Wars, starting under Thomas Jefferson, were fought for the principle of freedom of navigation and freedom of trade. One of the things that China does that the United States doesn't like is that it creates these cockamamie islands down in the South China Sea to create fake territorial claims on the water there so that it can limit the freedom of navigation. One of the things China does that the United States doesn't like is gets in these disputes with fishing boats from the Philippines over whether they're allowed to be in that water and engage in commerce there. Free trade is an American interest. It's not something that hurts us and makes us weaker in a strategic sense. And Dan makes the point too. Even if you think free trade is bad for America and that it helps China, then Trump's response to it doesn't make any sense. Dan asks a series of really good questions. He says, if the problem is that free trade makes China rich and dangerous, why are we punishing Taiwan when China's conquering it would strengthen the PRC? Why is the White House, amid a crackdown on foreign trade, protecting the Chinese-owned ByteDance from congressionally mandated divestment in TikTok? Why are we punishing countries such as Vietnam, which have stolen jobs from China, and pulling up the drawbridge against the allies we would need if we ever found ourselves in a direct confrontation with China? It doesn't make any sense. What would make sense as a political strategy here for the United States would be to create a big trading bloc of countries that doesn't include China. That was on the table about 10 years ago, something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been trading alliance with the United States and a lot of the other allied countries against China in the Pacific region. But Barack Obama gave up on that because labor unions didn't like it. Donald Trump gave up on it because he just doesn't like international trade. And now we're in a situation where we're putting tariffs on all those countries that are supposed to be our friends against China. Why? That's not good strategy. The U.S. successfully used free trade in the past to bring countries into our orbit. Dan writes, the great foreign policy impetus for the growth of an American-led free trade order after World War II, as well as Europe's post-World War II impetus for the growth of a common market, was to bind together the free nations of the world by commercial ties that would strengthen their military alliances as well as enriching their people. It was good economics and it was good strategy. Trump's not doing that. He's putting tariffs on countries we already have free trade agreements with. And so the only way to defend Trump's trade policy using some kind of grand strategy argument is to pretend he's doing something he's not doing. The executive order from Trump says that the problem is trade deficits. It says that the national emergency that it's trying to solve is the existence of the trade deficit. And it wants the trade deficit to come down. It doesn't say it's doing this primarily as a way to reduce trade barriers with our allies and unite them against China. It's just not what it's about. And this is where things could get very bad. The United States and China are the world's two largest economies. The tariff rate being applied to Chinese goods might as well be a ban. The administration has said that the rate is 145%. Maybe it'll change by the time you're actually listening to this, because apparently they can just change stuff whenever they want to. But basically cutting off all trade between the world's two largest economies is not a recipe for peace and happiness. That's a huge deal. Embargoes are considered acts of war. This isn't quite an embargo, but it's pretty close. If your concern is confrontation with China and with avoiding it, which it should be, because no one should want to have war between the United States and China. If your goal is preventing that, this trade policy is doing the opposite. It's making a confrontation or a war with China slightly more likely, not less likely. Free trade doesn't guarantee world peace, but it helps. Dan writes, a nation that thinks it can benefit at home and reduce its exposure to foreign conflicts by walling off its markets will soon discover that there is no refuge from the world. No American grand strategy that does away with friends and allies can magically prevent us from having enemies. Enemies who are all too quick to build their own bridges where we have burned them. That's exactly right. The idea that this policy that changes based on the president's social media posts is somehow a grand strategy, and that you just have to trust them because they're all working with information you don't have, and they have this great plan to negotiate all this stuff. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. I hope this podcast helped you to think about these issues a little bit more. Maybe give you some arguments to use when talking to people who are supporting protectionism. And let's hope the U.S. restores some common sense to its trade policy sometime soon. So now it's time for the paper of the episode. Before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. Papers from the National Bureau of Economic Research in October of 2020 by Douglas Irwin of Dartmouth College. It's called The Rise and Fall of Import Substitution. This is a really good paper about the history of economic thought around tariffs. There's a common narrative among protectionists that says that free trade is just this evidence-free ideology that all economists believe and nobody else believes. And that economists have just continued to think this since Adam Smith, and especially after World War II. And the only reason they think it is because they ignore all the evidence and they're obsessed with their textbook models. And this paper from Irwin shows that that isn't true. Because actually, after World War II, it was very, very common and very popular and very fashionable for economists to say that free trade is actually not good. And that's the economists who are recommending to all of the developing countries that were coming out from under colonialism after World War II. As the British Empire collapsed, the French Empire collapsed, and all these new independent poor countries were coming into existence. There were tons of economists educated at Western universities who had PhDs from Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard and all the rest of these places that were running around telling these countries, no, actually, free trade's bad. You need to do import substitution, which is you need to do industrial policy and protectionism to promote your domestic industry and replace the things that you currently import with stuff that's domestically produced. And a lot of these poor countries listened to those people because they said, you guys are the smart economists. That sounds great. We want to be rich. Let's do it. Argentina was one of the top examples. Disaster. India, another top example. Disaster. On a per capita GDP basis, India's wealth barely rose from independence in 1947 until markets were liberalized in 1991. Because for that entire span of almost 50 years, the Indian government was committed to import substitution. They were committed to the idea that free trade was bad, that they needed to develop their domestic market first, and they were doing that based on advice they got from Western educated economists. The reason economists support free trade now is not because they're ideological, it's not because they're ignoring the evidence. It's because they actually recommended the opposite. And it was actually tried by actual people in actual countries. And those places stayed poor. This was a revolution in the field of development economics, which initially said, that textbook stuff about free markets that we talk about, that might be true for rich countries, but it's probably not true for poor countries. And the poor countries actually need smart government planning to get there. That was what they used to believe. After decades of trying that, they saw it didn't work and they changed their view. And now most development economists will tell you that actually opening up to international markets is a smart thing for poor countries to do to help them to get richer. And it does work, because India since 1991 has had enormous economic growth. Argentina under Javier Milei right now is reducing its protectionism, and its economy is coming back to resembling a normal country's economy again, after being a complete basket case for decades. So the paper's called The Rise and Fall of Import Substitution. It's by Douglas Irwin. You should check it out. That's all for today. Remember that the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.